It's surprising when we look at the last days of Jesus' life on earth to notice that the people who are hailing his arrival on Sunday are the same ones calling for his execution 5 days later. This is a tribute to the fickleness of human beings, and it's also a grim reminder of the erosive impact of disappointment with God. We're going to pick up the narrative of Palm Sunday in Luke's account of Jesus' life. Because after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' tell him, 'The Lord needs it.'" They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." We find people cheering in verse 37, and then Jesus is weeping in verse 41. And the reason that Jesus is weeping is found in verse 44. It says, "Because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." And the fact is, that was God on that donkey. And that was God in their midst. And they failed to recognize him. How could that happen? God in their midst, and they failed to recognize him. We'll identify two reasons. We'll discover that the same two reasons explain our inability to recognize and appreciate God's activity now that we live 2 millennia later. Number one is misunderstanding the nature of God's power. We become disappointed with God because we misunderstand the nature of God's power. People were cheering because of all the miracles they had seen. Jesus was coming from the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. Bethany is a bedroom community, kind of a suburb of Jerusalem, 5 miles away. And as Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the dead and is walking, a huge entourage is with him, having witnessed the miracle. Crowds of people flocked from the bedroom town of Jerusalem to try to get a look at Jesus and Lazarus, the miracle man. And when he approached Jerusalem, they cheered because the one who wielded such power was coming to their hometown. They anticipated that perhaps he would do more miracles, that he would use his power to heal other sicknesses and diseases. After all, he had the power and would be close by. And he cared about people. He was compassionate. Jesus' miracles were provoked and triggered by a sense of compassion. When Jesus saw someone suffering, he felt that in his gut. And and he alleviated suffering. And they assumed that he would do that when he comes to Jerusalem. They also anticipated not just personal miracles, but even more significantly, national ones. And they had good reasons to do so. The expectation of this king who would come, and he would ride on a donkey, and he would display his power, was predicted and prophesied 500 years earlier by Zechariah. They recalled this prophecy, and it fit Jesus. He had the power to do miracles. He even used the predicted mode of transportation. Look what Zechariah says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit." They believed that Jesus would use his power to restore the nation of Israel to its former greatness. At that time, the nation of Israel was under the control of the Roman Empire, and they believed that the coming king would change all that, the one who comes on a donkey, the one who is powerful. The promised Messiah would be a political deliverer. That's what their understanding was. They assumed that Jesus would use his power to liberate Israel from Roman oppression. And when he was suspended from a cross 5 days later, they were bitterly disappointed. Romans were still in charge and were disappointed with Jesus. They didn't think he would represent God and not do the things they assumed he would do. It's common to read about Jesus' miracles and in good faith to anticipate him sending one our way. Maybe you've had reason to believe that you've been visited by a miracle, but there's other times where a miracle didn't show up. The person wasn't healed. The situation wasn't alleviated. After all, we assume that he has the power. He's willing. He cares about us. Why wouldn't he do that miracle? Why wouldn't he remove that circumstance? Why wouldn't he change that situation? Why wouldn't he do that? And sometimes he does, oftentimes he doesn't. And we assume, boy, if he did that, it would really cement my belief in him. It would be something that would be seemingly advantageous for him. Why wouldn't he do that? It was hard to keep a rising sense of disappointment at bay when miracles aren't forthcoming at that time and in our time, or not as predictable as we'd like. I was channel surfing once and was buzzed by some religious programming, and there was a TV evangelist that was promoting that God was active and God's activity would increase. And the tagline, he said, was, "And because God would be active, nothing broken, nothing missing." Nothing broken, nothing missing. God's going to use his power to fix what's broken and to return what's missing. Paul presents a different image of the impact of God's power. And it really doesn't fit with nothing broken, nothing missing. But it says, but Jesus said to me, Paul writes, "My grace is sufficient for you." And here's the verse. "My power is made perfect in weakness." Therefore, Paul writes, "I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Jesus' power arms itself when it is mixed with human weakness. And that's a strange thing. It arms itself. It becomes live, it becomes powerful, it's turned on, it's activated, whatever image or analogy you want to use, it becomes armed, it becomes effective, active, strong, when combined with human weakness. They were disappointed at that time because in our time they misunderstood the nature of God's power, that God's power would be used to alleviate weaknesses, to overcome obstacles, to fix things that are broken. So there's nothing broken, nothing missing. Apparently, Jesus will not use divine power to erase our weaknesses, or wipe out our enemies, or clear out our distractors. And they didn't understand that, and we still have a hard time understanding it, because they misunderstood the nature of God's power. And they also misunderstood the nature of God's peace. They misunderstood the nature of God's power, and they misunderstood the nature of God's peace, and that's why they were disappointed with God, and why we become disappointed with Him in our day as well. People cheered Jesus because they believed He would usher that nation into a time of peace and prosperity. And again, Zechariah causes them to see that as possible. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous, having salvation, gentle, riding on a donkey. I call the foal of a donkey. He will proclaim peace to the nation. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. He would use his kingly reign to establish peace. That's what they read. That's what he promised. And that's what they believed would happen. But they misunderstood the nature of that peace. The context in Zechariah clarifies the nature of the peace he would bring. Verse 11, it says he would free prisoners from the waterless pit. So the kind of peace that the king would usher is that he would release prisoners from the waterless pit. Here is a prophecy in Jeremiah. It says, my people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. There's two kinds of supplies of water that existed in Israel at this time. There was a cistern. A cistern's a hole in the ground. You dig away, it's like a well. And so this well collects rainwater. And if you look into this well, it is flat and calm because it's not fed by an underground spring. It's a limited supply of water. And so that's a cistern. And there is also springs. And a spring is fed from under the ground. On the way to school, and when I lived in Saugus, there was on the bank of a brook, a creek. It wasn't very big. When you crossed over into almost getting to the high school, there was a place where there was really cold water that came out of the bank of this creek, and we all knew about it, and we'd go there. And what he describes here is that the idea of the difference between a cistern, which holds rainwater, and a spring, which is fed from underneath, that those kinds of supplies, they give us an idea of what sin is about, and also what peace is about. It talks about what sin is about. Sin can be lumped into two categories. We just might call them sin type 1 and sin type 2. Sin type 1 involves forsaking the spring of living water. There's only one. Forsaking the spring of living water. God depicts himself as the spring of living water. And he sees himself as, then, the satisfier of our deepest thirsts. Not just the satisfier initially, but a satisfier in an ongoing way. He is a endless supply, like the spring that never stops providing water. And that's the sense. Sin number one is that we forsake the spring of living water. And for some reason, maybe because we misunderstand the nature of his power, or we misunderstand the nature of his peace, and we don't admit our thirst. But for whatever the reason, we feel thirsty, but we don't bring our thirst to the spring. We forsake the spring of living water. If we forsake the spring of living water, what's going to happen? We're going to become thirsty. So that's sin type 1, is forsaking the spring, and it leads naturally to sin type 2, which is digging a cistern. Now, cisterns are good at meeting some type of needs, but they aren't good at supplying an ongoing, predictable supply of water. They just don't do that. The problem with cisterns is that they develop leaks and cracks. So the way it works then is that you dig this well, it collects rainwater, but but what happens sometimes is that it develops cracks and the water leaches away. And so what you end up having is a muddy hole. Interestingly, when Jeremiah was thrown into prison in the Old Testament, he was thrown into a waterless pit. And the image is somebody digging a hole in order to satisfy thirst. Digging the hole, and assuming, oh boy, the water doesn't stay here really well, but if I dig a little bit more, I'm sure I'll get more water. And so you dig, and at some point, you're digging this well in order to meet your needs, and the problem is that you've dug so deep now that this has become a waterless pit, and the waterless pit becomes a prison. That's what they threw Jeremiah into. And it's an interesting picture. Sometimes we desperately seek to meet our needs in a cistern that wasn't created to meet our deepest needs. And we keep on trying whether this cistern is a person or a government or an experience or something that we look to provide some of our needs, which is okay. The problem is when we bring spring-rated thirsts to a cistern-rated supply. We have thirsts inside that are spring-rated thirsts that cannot be satisfied by something temporary. It can't be, but what ends up happening, we bring our thirst to something temporary and we assume, what's wrong with this thing? There's something wrong here. If I keep on digging, I'm sure this thing will provide what I need. I'm sure it will supply what I need. My thirst is only temporary. That's what ends up happening. We dig, and sometimes we dig so far that we get to a place that this thing that we have come to try to get our thirst met has become a prison. Now I can't get out. I've spent so much time trying to get my needs met from something that can't meet my needs, but now I've dug so deep and so long that I can't get out. We can draw a sense of satisfaction from job, and certainly family and sport and activities and kids, and there's all kinds of things that we draw a sense of satisfaction from. But what God says, He alone is an inexhaustible supply, and that's the problem. A good husband, a good wife, a good job, these are good cisterns, but they're not good springs. They don't meet the deepest needs, and what God says is that He is that source. Peace comes from then drawing the right source from the right supply. What can we say? Disappointment is trying to meet a need in the wrong place? Treating God like something temporary, treating something else as something permanent. God promises that the king he would send, well, what it says, that I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Those pits that have become prison, what Jesus says he's come to do is not to protect people from digging waterless pits, but being the one who would come to reach in and pull them out. You can't get out of a waterless pit by yourself. You can't. But what you need to do, apparently, as with anything with needs, what Jesus said once in John 7, and he yelled it out in the middle of Jerusalem. If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. And out of his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. And he yelled it. And then people had to admit they're thirsty. That could be a hard thing. Well, God's powerful, so it would be a problem to admit I'm thirsty. No, it isn't. He comes and uses his power to meet thirst. Sometimes we have a hard time admitting we're thirsty. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes we just aren't aware of. Sometimes, and oftentimes I would say, we don't admit that we're thirsty because we're so preoccupied with blaming. I mean, if I just had a better cistern, a better wife, a better government, a better job. It's not that I'm thirsty, it's just that I'm just saddled with the wrong supply. So we can stay back when that's the first thing, you have to be thirsty. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are thirsty. And what you have to do, say, okay, that's me. But then if you admitted you were thirsty, what would the cistern that you live with say? Might not, you don't understand what I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. Be thirsty. And the next thing you have to do is come to him. Be thirsty, come to me. That's what he said. Be thirsty, come to me and drink. Which of those three is challenging? Be thirsty, come to Jesus, and drink. Would you agree with me? If you're thirsty and there's a supply of water, it's not real hard to drink. I mean, if we have a drinking problem, we're not going to do this. If there's a supply, drinking's easy. Drinking's simple. I think the first two are challenging. You got to admit you're thirsty. Are you thirsty? Or just have you been mistreated? Now, you might have been mistreated. Well, what's the deepest thing about you? That you've been mistreated or that you're thirsty? On the day when he yelled it out, anyone thirsty? You raise your hand. Oh, I'm thirsty. And then I think that's the hardest thing. Then you come to him. Because if you raise your hand, what he would say, that's exactly what I've come to use my power and peace. Not to prevent you from being thirsty. Things go bad. Things don't meet our needs. We become disappointed. We think God made that happen. What God's doing, he sent the one to meet the deepest needs, which are eternal, not just this world. Eternally, we have eternal thirst. A thirst that was meant to be met by an eternal supply. And that's, sometimes we end up experiencing temporal things so that we could tie into an eternal source God promised that the king he would send would pull us out of waterless pits. His power doesn't make troubles disappear because he wants to pull us out of powerless, waterless pits. His peace doesn't make threats evaporate. His peace is found in deeper realms than worldly peace. And when we learn to drink, it becomes a source of deep satisfaction. However, it's, as he says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. His peace and his power don't eliminate problems. What he wants us to do in the midst of a problem, he wants us to recognize with peace. Recognize our thirst. Recognize your thirst. What are you thirsty for? A promotion? I think we're thirsty to have something that we can rely on in an ongoing way. Jesus said, you will leave me all alone. And I am not alone, for the Father is with me. That's one of the things that we really want. If you think of why you're disappointed, would you agree with me? One of the things that's most disappointing is when people you depend on desert you. And they don't say the things you need to hear. They're not in the places that you need them to be. And you feel alone and isolated and disappointed. Sometimes we feel disappointed with God because we feel distance from him, because he didn't do the miracle. He didn't provide the thing. He didn't prevent the circumstance. Again, we misunderstand the nature of his power and peace. He doesn't prevent these things from happening. They end up happening so that we can, well, look what it says, connect with him. You will leave me all alone, Jesus said, yet I'm not alone, for my Father is with me. I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have trouble. In me, you can have peace. In the world, you're going to have trouble. In me, Jesus said, you can have peace. In the world, you're going to have trouble. He's not invested in using his peace and power to eliminate trouble, but to be with us in the midst of it. We become disappointed with God when we misunderstand the nature of his power and the nature of his peace. He doesn't deploy his power and peace to eliminate troubles, but to enable us to endure them. Jesus, when he initiated the Lord's Supper, it was at a time where everybody, he knew that he was going to abandon them. And he gives them a rite, a ritual that symbolizes. And he asked them to repeat it. That's why we repeat it 2,000 years later. Communion. It says, Paul writes, I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. But this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. The old covenant predicted that God would kind of alleviate problems, take them away, land, seed, and blessing. The new covenant is different. He tells us that we're going to have problems, but he also tells us he's going to be with us in the midst of them, and that's what the new covenant indicates. We're going to grab the elements now, and when you do that, bring them back to the table, and then we'll think about a couple words, and then we'll eat the bread and drink the cup, and we'll think about what he invites us to do. At a time when the world was falling apart, Jesus said that he would be with them. He would not just be with them physically, but he would rise from the dead. Here's a question. It says in Romans 8, he who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, freely give us all things? It's a question. based on logic from the greater to the lesser. If somebody does the greatest thing, will they do a lesser thing? And here's what it says. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also along with him freely give us all things? I have a question for you. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all, how will he not also along with him freely give us all things? You think that God is holding back. We become disappointed. If God is holding back, he would never have sent his son. Not holding back. His power and peace exist, but he wants us to be thirsty and come to him and drink. Are you thirsty? Disappointed? Come to him. He's the supply. And what he wants us to do as a symbol of depending on him, he says is, I want you to take me inside. I don't want to be outside with you. I want to be inside you, in the place where I am always with you. Take and drink. And stand for closing prayer. Father, in this world we experience troubles, and your power and your peace don't exist to eliminate them. Not presently, anyway. What you've done, though, is you've made it so that your presence not only goes with us, but that it lives inside of us. And the source of power and peace lives inside. We're going to experience things that are difficult, and you want to teach us to be able to experience the security of knowing that you're with us. It takes a long time. It's difficult. Would you continue to help us to learn to believe that you're with us? In Jesus' name, amen.